Hello, and thank you for joining me for a very exciting cruise to two remarkable islands. Way down at the southern edge of that Cycladic archipelago of islands in the middle of the Aegean Sea, only about 90 or 100 sea miles from Athens, but worlds of their own. They are volcanic islands called Milos and Santorini. One of them, Milos, is very infrequently visited, although it should be seen by as many people as possible. The other, Santorini, is in fact one of the most popular tourist destinations in the Mediterranean. But we're going to try to give them both equal billing and see how much that little-known island of Milos has to offer, and how many things on Santorini itself, once we get past the touristic facade, are there and yet frequently passed over by casual visitors. The ferry boat from Piraeus goes 87 miles south through the Aegean Sea to get to Milos. Now, the ancient name of that island, Melos, meant apple because of its round shape. Milos is in fact a volcanic mountain that's risen up from the depths of the Aegean Sea. The heat and the lava produced by that African plate, which started some 25 million years ago to plow under Europe. And as it made friction underneath the rocks deep in the mantle, lava was formed, which found an exit at Milos and then further to the east, Santorini, thus causing these volcanoes, these sort of somewhat circular islands, Santorini more than Milos in Milos's current eroded state, that bear witness to the torture of the earth through all this volcanism. Milos and Santorini are the sort of apex, if we can think of an apex being at the bottom of something rather than the top, of what is called the Aegean volcanic arc. Now you enter Milos crater, the caldera in the middle of that lost volcano, and you are entering one of the most extraordinary bays and harborages in all of the Mediterranean. And if Milos had not been a purely volcanic island with very little fresh water of its own, it might have become one of the great centers of civilization. As it was, it did manage to make a remarkable record for all sorts of things, as we will see. You are first struck by the fact this place is a geologist's dream. The different colors of rocks are all exposed because there's very little vegetation on this dry island. You see the prevailing orange and browns of a volcanic landscape, but also slashes of white and black. Some of that black is a very important volcanic rock, a volcanic glass, in fact, called obsidian. And in ancient times, obsidian was prized for the very sharp edge that it could take if you struck flakes off the core that you'd pulled out of the volcanic cliff. It was also dazzlingly beautiful, translucent if you chipped it finely enough, and until the arrival of bronze, it was the most prized substance for making the edge of a knife or of a sickle or of any other kind of blade. We in fact know that mainlanders from Greece were practicing seafaring and coming in ships to Milos and carrying their obsidian, the Melians obsidian, back to the Peloponnese, because we find that distinctively chemically marked obsidian of Milos in places like Francthi Cave on the eastern side of the Peloponnese, not too far from the Argolid, proving, although we don't have the ships, that they were already seafarers 10,000 years ago and more, because there's no other way they could have gotten out to those islands except in a ship. If you want to see some of that extraordinary landscape of, let's say, white pumice, you don't need to go to the main southern block of the island, which is mostly given over to the mineralogical work and the mining. Lots of these volcanic minerals and rocks are still being extracted and mined today. Near the north end, where all of the archaeological sites are, not too far from the ferry landing itself, you will be able to see some fabulous white pumice sculpted by the wind at a place called Sarakiniko, a little bit north of where we're going to get off our boat. Now, as we land from the ferry, we want to get some transport, unless you really want to do an awful lot of hiking, up to the top of a hill on which is the main town of Milos, a place called Plaka. In Plaka is the archaeological museum of the island, and at some point, please visit it, because you will be greeted as you walk into the main hall by the single figure who most represents Milos to the world, familiar to anyone who's ever seen a book on world art, the Venus de Milo. Yes, that M-I-L-O is the Italian version of the island's name, which is Milos in the modern Greek spelling, and Melos, M-E-L-O-S, in the ancient Greek. She was discovered, allegedly, by a farmer of Milos, not too far from where you're standing, on a farm where he was digging in his field. He supposedly found this statue right then in 1820, when there happened to be some French warships in the area and some French sailors were on the island. They were all art lovers and, of course, connoisseurs of the female form, and the pieces of this remarkable statue of Venus that the farmer had brought up made a huge sensation with these visiting Frenchmen. There were many negotiations involving even the French ambassador way off in Istanbul, because at this point, 1820, Milos was still part of the Ottoman Empire. But by one way or another, most of the pieces of the statue were put on a French warship, taken on a triumphal tour of the Eastern Mediterranean, and ended up in Paris, put by King Louis XVIII himself in the Louvre as one of its chief and most celebrated treasures. There's a mystery about her arms. From that period of discovery, around 1820, a sketch has been preserved that shows the arms on the statue. She's standing in a pigsty. The pigs are around her, at least one is shown in this little sketch. And she is reaching down with her right arm to hold that robe which is slipping down off her body. She's holding with one hand that robe, and if you look at the statue, that makes sense, because in fact, there's nothing holding up that drapery otherwise. It is slipping off, so there would be the hand to give that sort of dramatic moment when she's about to reveal herself, and the other hand, the left hand, was reaching off, holding the apple that Paris, the Prince of Troy, had awarded to her as the fairest in that contest with the goddesses Athena and Hera. And thus, when Aphrodite, or Venus, awarded to Paris his prize for giving her the apple, Helen of Troy, the entire Trojan War saga was kicked off. I recommend that you go west from Plaka, get some sort of conveyance, bus, taxi, car, bicycle, to the sea, where you will find an ancient classical theater. This is one of the loveliest ones I know. I'm prejudiced because I visited during the height of the wildflower season one spring, and the poppies and the other wildflowers formed sort of a surf that came up to my waist as I waded through them to get to this beautiful theater. The theater is in ruins, but in this case, I'm rather thankful for the ruins. The seating faces the water. You're looking out into the vast bay of Milos with the southern part of the island on the other side. Originally, of course, there would have been a skene building, that word S-K-E-N-E, as we transliterate it from the Greek, being the ancestor of our scene. And that scene would have blocked from view, for the ancient spectators, all that vast grandeur of the Melian landscape and the sea. We get to sit there, with or without wildflowers, and enjoy it. You will also see near the theater the little plaque that marks the spot where the Venus de Milo, possibly the most famous single piece of classical art, Greek or Roman, where she allegedly came out of the ground. And I have to say allegedly because there are a number of different extremely conflicting stories about exactly when she was found, what condition she was in, and how she passed from the farmer in Milos into the hands of the French. Nonetheless, you're close to the spot where she was discovered. But we're also close to another spot. We are in walking distance of one of the most historic places in Europe as far as the early history of Christianity goes, because very near this theater of Milos that would have been sacred to Dionysus, and very near where the Aphrodite herself may have been set up, sacred to other gods, is a very early monument to the Christian faith in the Aegean, in the Cyclades, a set of catacombs, burial places, and possibly meeting places for early Christians in that first century AD, when Christianity was still a very suspect religion in the Roman world, because the Christians, believing in only one God, refused to participate in emperor worship, which was the equivalent of committing an act of treason. The catacombs at Milos have not been precisely dated. They had been swept clean by looters before the archaeologists got there. There were no bodies, almost no remains of any kind. But the inscriptions on the wall make it clear they belong to the first century of the Christian era. They may actually predate the much more famous catacombs of Rome, but they have something in common with those catacombs of Rome. They are dug into volcanic rock. You may not be aware that the 7 hills of Rome have been sculpted by the river Tiber out of a mass of volcanic material in the landscape, and that the only reason the catacombs exist under Rome is because it's so easy to dig through that rock. Also, if you're tunneling through the rock for building material, you will make catacombs, which are simply these underground tunnels which have been turned to other purposes by carving little areas in the wall which can take a coffin or a body, or hollowing out places in the floor that can be vaults for the reception of the dead. In the catacombs at Milos, there are more than 290 of these little chambers, either set into the walls or in the floor, could have held 1,000 or 2,000 individuals, all of whom, regrettably, are gone. But a few traces remain in the beautifully lit part of the catacombs that you can visit. And among those are some inscriptions on the walls. The one that I find most moving whenever I see it is the little code word that Christians used in that early time, that dangerous time, to identify themselves to each other, the Greek word ichthys, which meant fish. Now, fish, as we would transliterate it from the Greek, is I-C-H-T-H-U-S. And that's the start of our word ichthyologist, someone who studies fish. But that was an anagram in Greek. The iota that began it stood for Jesus, Jesus. The chi, or ch, that followed the iota, that stood for Christos, anointed one. The theta, the th, was for theos, God. The u for huios, son. And the s at the end, soter, Savior. Jesus Christ, God's Son and Savior. All you had to say was fish, or draw a fish in the sand, or display a cup with a fish on it, and you had identified yourself to fellow Christians by this code as one of the new religion. After we have left the catacombs, we make our way back to Plaka. I urge you to enjoy a little of the island hospitality in one of the tavernas. And I wish for you some of the same joy that I experienced on Milos when I happened upon a local traditional celebration of a religious event, Easter. Throughout the islands, indeed throughout Greece and Turkey, local communities throughout the year will have religious festivals, traditional celebrations of historic events, or other reasons to party. Well, Easter is a big one in the Greek world. It's not celebrated on the same day, the same Sunday as the Western Christian Easter, so check your calendar. But as I was walking back up to Plaka, I saw children out with baskets with brightly colored eggs and beautiful flowers arranged in them. They were going door to door. And I was told that this was a local tradition, that the children made those baskets, carried them door to door, were in fact conferring a blessing on the houses that they visited by coming with their Easter baskets, and people in return put little gifts, coins, candy, into the baskets, thus, in my mind, sort of bringing together our two traditions of Halloween trick-or-treating and the Easter basket in a very beautiful way, and in something that obviously drew the whole community together. I'd like to especially urge you, beyond attempting to see some of these local festivals, to try to see some Greek traditional dancing while you are on your tour. Men and women alike do this, but usually not together. The movie Zorba the Greek has familiarized all of us with that line of men, arms raised, and the man on the end, as they do this sort of line dance, performing extraordinary feats of gymnastics and dexterity and leaping, and a real master dancer to see one of these groups at their work in a traditional dance, wearing their traditional clothing, is indeed a highlight of any tour of the Greek islands. East of Milos lies Santorini, looming up out of the sea. You can get to Santorini from Athens and other points of departure by airplane, but I urge you to try to go by ferry boat. You can get there from Piraeus or from Iraklio on the north shore of Crete, and from some other island destinations also. If you come by ferry boat, you will be rewarded by a scene unlike any other on this earth, coming into the crater of an enormous volcano, the striped cliffs above you with their red and black and white and yellow rocks gleaming in the sun, every new movement of the ship giving you a vista, opening up in the most dramatic possible way as you enter this alien world of the crater, the caldera of the ancient volcano that is today the archipelago of Santorini. The islands have been broken apart from the single crater by earthquakes and by erosion, so you now see a little cluster of islands, and as I say, it's a sight never to be forgotten. You will take your landing from the ferry boat at a spot inside the crater on the southern part of the island. It is not really very close to any of the things that you are going to want to see. So this means that you must arrange your transportation in Santorini before you get on the ferry boat. Bring your car with you or your motorbike, or have called in advance to a hotel to pick you up, to a rental agency to bring your car, but please don't leave yourself standing on the dock. There are donkeys, but I do not recommend them as your mode of transport around this really surprisingly large island. The main island is on the east, curves around like an inverted letter C, and we are facing in. Out in the middle of the caldera, we can see a couple of islands, also shaped sort of like volcanic cones. They are the new Santorini. The big opening in the middle that you are looking at, the caldera of Santorini, was made in very prehistoric times, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of years ago, by a gigantic explosion. It's not correct, as was originally thought, to think that there was a Mount Kilimanjaro or Mount Fuji rising up in the middle of the Aegean that sometime in the second millennium BC blew its top and caused the biggest tsunamis and destructive clouds of ash ever seen in historic times. We now know that there was a smaller volcano out in the middle that blew its top about 1620 BC, buried a town on the south side of Santorini, a town that we've given the name Akrotiri to, and that is the historic eruption. Well, after it blew its top and sank, for a long time there was no island in the middle of the caldera of Santorini. It was bare and open, like the vast bay in the middle of the island of Milos that we just visited. But in 197 BC, the Hellenistic age, suddenly there was a volcanic eruption. Well, this was a high point for natural science and philosophy. People were fascinated by the arrival of a new mountain onto the Earth's surface. There'd been no suspicion up until that time that Santorini was a volcanic island, so it really, in both senses, made waves. That island is still visible. It's called Palaya Kameni, Old Kameni, and next to it is another island, an island I urge you to try to visit while you're in Santorini. That other island is called Nea Kameni, New Kameni. It's smaller and lower, but since it has been continually active and erupting since 1707 of our own era, you can find yourself, once you take the little ferry boat over there, it also leaves from Fira, the main town of Santorini, further to the north, number of different ways to get out to Nea Kameni. You're walking around on some of the Earth's newest surface, and as at Milos, it is as desolate, as barren as the face of the moon, but with the addition that here and there you see steam and smoke coming up out of the ground. Bring your bathing suit and do as an ancient Greek would have done. Pull on your suit and bathe in some of the hot volcanic springs that are around the perimeter and, as they allege, feel 10 years younger after the experience is over. That town that was destroyed by the volcanic eruption that is now pretty securely dated to the 1620s BC was a Minoan town founded by colonists from Crete centuries earlier. that was perched on the southern edge and had a neighborhood pretty high up on the slope, well away from the sea, that came to light during the process of mining the island's volcanic material for a substance called pozzolana. Pozzolana was originally discovered in the Bay of Naples by the Romans, the result of the eruptions of Mount Vesuvius and other Italian flows of volcanic material. Pozzolana is a volcanic sand which can take the place of beach sand in concrete and create a hydraulic cement. In other words, you can pour the mix into water and it will set up without ever having been exposed to the air to be dried. It was being mined in the middle of the 19th century to get concrete materials for the building of the Suez Canal. So masses of the island of Santorini were being quarried away, loaded into ships, and carried south to Egypt. And as this mining and tunneling went on through the Pozzolana layers, the miners hit a buried town, a Minoan Pompeii. That town has been called Akrotiri. It is the chief historical site on the island of Santorini, and it's one that, if it's open, and please check before you go, you must try to visit. Imagine a scene of 1650 BC there on Santorini, this beautiful island that you are on. Imagine the same landscape that you are seeing now, because the artists of Akrotiri put frescoes on the walls of these houses that have been excavated. The frescoes have now been taken off and are put in museums. But those frescoes show how much they love their landscape. They painted the volcanic rocks, the strata, the colors, the weird wind-sculpted shapes. They showed the lilies and crocuses that were growing in this desolate landscape, just as I saw those wildflowers back on Milos. And they show some of the wildlife, the swallows who've come up from Africa in their mating dances, or in fact, possibly these dueling swallows from the Akrotiri frescoes are pairs of males fighting for territory. They show you the people, the working people of Akrotiri, of that ancient Minoan colony on the south end of the island, fishermen holding their bunches of fish. But they also show us the sport, the life, the delight of the upper classes. The little area that's been excavated of this community is high up above the sea. I don't think it's a typical part of the town. I think we have somehow stumbled upon the Malibu, the Beverly Hills area of this ancient Minoan community, by very good luck, because we are seeing, for instance, frescoes that show fleets of ships from the island, with the island's weird landscape behind. And they're not warships in this fresco, which is called the Admiral's House fresco. They are decked out for processions, garlanded for religious occasions, and seem to be being ceremoniously rowed or paddled around the caldera, around the little archipelago of islands there of old Santorini. We see the beautiful women of that lost island world with their bodices open, something so unusual in the art and dress styles of ancient civilizations. We see children boxing, and they're displaying strange haircuts that are found nowhere else on Earth, where they seem to have shaved most of the head and painted it blue, but allowed a few pieces, chunks of hair, to grow very long in sort of dreadlocks coming down their sides, a unique feature of the Santorini world. In addition to these fabulous frescoes, which show how rich these houses were, very little else was found. And that's because, as we reconstruct it, this truly was a Minoan Pompeii. Pompeii, that Italian, that Roman city, which was buried by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, had an initial warning. Some years earlier, there'd been a severe earthquake, and in fact, the Pompeians were in the process of putting their town back together when the bigger catastrophe of the volcanic eruption hit and buried it all together. The same thing turned out to be true at Akrotiri. The houses had been swept clean of their belongings when the archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos started digging there in the 1960s. He found very few precious treasures. There was only one piece of gold, a little golden figurine of an animal called an ibex. That ibex had been in a box. The box had been laid on a big stack of rubble. The rubble had been collected from the streets by people who had come back to the town after an earthquake that destroyed a lot of the houses And these were the cleaning crews, the wrecking crews, the fix up the town again crews, who were demolishing cracked walls, mixing paints and plasters, restoring the houses, gathering together the bits and pieces of furniture that remained, and in short, trying to reestablish a town that had been abandoned because of an earthquake. That's the town that was sealed in. The frescoes were there because they were painted on the walls. A few portable objects were there because people had missed them when they ran away. No human bodies were found. The only living thing that was found was the skull of a monkey who must have been a pet of somebody, and he ran away and couldn't be caught when they evacuated. And in the midst of this restoration project of a town very severely damaged by an earthquake, the volcano blew up. The restoration gang was able to get off the hill down to their ships and, let's hope, get away. We don't actually know. Perhaps a lot of the ships and the evacuees are now sealed down under the Aegean Sea by the explosion and all the ash and volcanic material that fell. But they left behind this town, and in a few cases, it's been possible to not only collect the big pots and so on that were there, but reconstruct the furniture. Most of the objects from Santorini are kept up in the principal touristic town to visit, Fira, in a beautiful little museum there. The frescoes are in many cases there, or some of them in Athens in the National Museum. But I'd really like you to pay attention to some things that certainly dazzle me. At the old Pompeii, the original Pompeii in Italy, the Italians had found that when there were cavities in the volcanic ash, you could pour plaster of Paris in, blow it around to fill the cavity, and once it dried, chip away the volcanic matrix, and there was a model of what had been inside. In Pompeii, this was mainly used to reconstruct the forms of humans who had been trapped in the volcanic material. The organic material of their bodies had decayed away, but the negative image of the person was still there, and those are some of the most extraordinary things to see at Pompeii. At Akrotiri in Santorini, it was furniture. And you will see a beautiful three-legged wooden stool with Rococo carving on the legs that I think a king of France would have killed for. Obviously, just an ordinary part of the extraordinary lifestyle that went on in these long-vanished communities, such as Akrotiri, destroyed and buried for so many centuries by that explosion in about 1620 BC. The place to end your visit, and perhaps to spend a lot of your time, is either the town of Fira, above the main docking point for the cruise ships, perched on the edge of the caldera, looking west across it. That's where the archaeological museum is, many of the beautiful churches, my favorite cafe in the Aegean, Cafe Amnesia, or go on north to the far tip to the town of Oia, or as it's also sometimes confusingly spelled, Oia, O-I-A, and find yourself in a quiet place, not like Fira, pulsing with the party beat, with the cruise ship passengers, with the thirsters for fun, but up in a town that actually has a law that you can't play music inside that can be heard in the street. Sit out on the edge of the crater. Watch the sun decline toward the western horizon. Order a glass of good Santorini wine from grapes grown in strange little circular formations close to the ground, as if in baskets out of the wind, sort of imbibing into their essence some of that volcanic burn from the soil, but not unpleasant. And as you sip, I hope you'll drink a toast to all those great seafarers of Santorini, all those ancient Minoans and others who have been here before you and have enjoyed the sight of this incredible islandscape.